Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. Today is Wednesday, January 16th, 2019. Tonight's webinar was originally created with the idea that while children are in treatment, oftentimes there can be a refocusing on the couple's dynamic. Some of it that is around co-parenting, but some of it is around this idea that once you pull the identified patient out of the family, that there it can rearrange the couple's attention and energy towards each other. And one thing I think about often as I do this work, and of course most of my psychoeducation is around parenting. Most of what I teach is around parenting. I go back to this idea that it's all so much the same kind of psychology and science. That really the work is about being a person, being a self, and being a relationship to another person. And so, of course, there are distinct differences in relationships between a spouse or a child, between a boss, a friend, a coworker, an employee, all of those kinds of dynamics. But in my experience, there's so much more in common than there is different. So with that in mind, I wanted to do this broadcast again. This is one of my favorite subjects, because I think there's a lot of things in our culture that guide us away from the kind of wisdom that those who study relationships and coupleships can teach us. And so I'm going to debunk a few ideas and give you a couple of core principles, ideas as we go along tonight. First off, I start with this idea. This really came to me from another marriage therapist that I was actually in a session with as a client. We'd actually hired this individual. He was a business consultant, but also he had training as a couples therapist, a marriage therapist. So he had those two backgrounds, and we were having problems in our leadership team years ago. And so he brought us in and heard all of our complaints. And then he asked us this question, and 3 out of the 4 of us in the partnership were marriage and family therapists. He asked us the question, what's the responsibility of the individual in marriage? Because we were all family therapists, couples therapists, we all had answers to that question. And so we all gave our perspective. And he asked us, he said, what if the answer was to enjoy your partner? What if that was your responsibility? To take pleasure in your partner? How are you doing in that responsibility, in that task? And it's taken me a while for that to really sink in, but it first changed my perspective that my enjoyment of my partner was a great deal about me. That the idea of beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and enjoying somebody is in the ears and the eyes of the beholder in the same way. So I'm going to talk tonight about what I think is a fundamental error that we learn about, that we think about in coupleships. This idea that it's our job to make the other person happy, right? That we are to rescue the other person. And I'm also going to talk about what I think are some fundamental misunderstandings about what intimacy is. And as we start to embark on a new kind of relationship with our partner, and we seek to have a more and more intimate relationship with them, how it's going to feel, because it doesn't feel warm and fuzzy and it feels very threatening. And then I'll talk about, again, the idea about what it means to be in a marriage and a partnership in the bigger perspective, even talking about how the roots of conflict and potential divorce, the seeds of that divorce were present in our courtship, were present in our falling in love story, which is what therapists mean when they say that the solution isn't divorce, right? The divorce may be a choice that you make as a part of your solution, but that doesn't solve anything necessarily fundamental in and of itself. There's something in you, in each of you, that needs to be worked out, that needs to be healed. I read this interesting article a couple of years ago called Why You Will Marry the Wrong Person. And it really does speak to this idea that I'm talking about tonight, about how we get into a relationship in kind of this, what some therapists will call this kind of psychotic episode that we call falling madly in love with each other. Even the term madly and madly in love hints to the fact of how crazy and irrational it can be. The author here says compatibility is an achievement of love. It must not be its precondition. So this idea that a lot of times what draws us into each other our wounds, and that as we work those out, as we heal those, we'll become more and more capable of being in a relationship. I love this quote from Captain Corelli's Mandolin. Love is a temporary madness. It erupts like an earthquake and then subsides. And when it subsides, you have to make a decision. You have to work out whether your roots have become so entwined together that it's inconceivable that you should ever part. Because this is what love is. Love is not breathlessness. It's not excitement. It's not the promulgation, sorry, of promises of eternal passion. That it's just being in love. That's just being in love, which any of us can convince ourselves we are. Love itself is what is left over when being in love has burned away. And this is both an art and a fortunate accident. Your mother and I had it. We had roots that grew towards each other underground. And when all the pretty blossoms had fallen from our branches, we found that we were one tree and not two. So this idea of falling in love versus what love is. Falling in love is a temporary madness. It really is a separation from reality. We don't need to eat. We don't need to sleep, right? We lose ourselves. We make dramatic decisions during that madly falling in love period. And then we end up together. And then we get to know each other. And then we start to unravel the reality of what it means to be a couple. And we have to decide if we're going to stick with it in that process. For a lot of the parents that I work with, there's this period, like I said, where the identified patient is pulled out of the system, right? Sent away to treatment, enters treatment, and so it creates a new focus, a new energy, right? There's not that triangulation, right? Your anxiety can't be directed on the child's issues. It gets left just between the two of you. There's this premature empty nest for some people. It happened out of order. And I think there is a grief and a loss. You know, I hear some therapists in our field try to talk parents out of that feeling, but when you have an idea about what life is going to be like, I even heard somebody during a presentation today talking about LGBTQ individuals. You might have had a fantasy about having a cisgender heterosexual child and a traditional family, and letting go of that dream, that expectation is like grieving, and you could do that. The presenter said, not in front of the child or with the child, but you can do that with a therapist. So whatever our expectations are, whatever we thought it was going to be like, when we thought our child was going to go away to college along traditional life timelines, it's a real loss, and that's okay. And if the therapist can't tolerate it, you can remind them that it's okay, that you have the capacity to feel grief and loss and still move through the process. There becomes some, like I said, some new areas to focus on between the two of you. And the definition of intimacy and the ingredients that go into intimacy. Intimacy can only occur to the extent that there are two whole selves. And so for all of us, there's some limitations to that, right? We're growing constantly. My experience is we never really arrive, but we're finding ourselves, we're developing ourselves in this process. So this idea that the task of intimacy can be created separate from individual development doesn't make a lot of sense. By definition, it requires two complete or whole selves in its ideal form. So the more we develop that, the more capable we are of intimacy. Parent-child challenges are not the cause of marital issues, but they absolutely are a force, an energy that can expose invisible fissures at the foundation of any relationships. So they expose us, those challenges. And in some ways, the child is asking for the parents to work on themselves, to work on that relationship, to focus on that unconsciously. I love this quote from a book. It comes from a larger book called Meeting the Shadow, and it's a series of essays. And Robert Bly talks about this idea. So I maintain that out of a round globe of energy, the 20-year-old ends up with a slice. Well, imagine that he meets a woman. Let's say they are both 24. She has a thin, elegant slice left also. They join each other in a ceremony, and this union of two slices is called a marriage. Even together, they do not make up one whole person. We have to come to terms with the fact that there is work to be done in the process of becoming a self. If we can't see that, if we don't know that, if we don't take that on as a project, intimacy and coupleship is going to suffer in tandem to that lack of project, that lack of focus. This is why I want to pause here, because I think this relates back to the program that we run with adolescents and young adults. So many people talk about this idea of how can you work on relationships when people aren't together. It's one of the most common questions I get asked as a marriage therapist, family therapist, running a program where adolescents and young adults are separated from their family for some period of time. And it's a simple answer. The first thing that we're helping each member of the relationship, each member of the family to work on is themselves. We're helping them develop the capacity for intimacy. And when we slow the process down, when we create this distance physically, and communication is slow through letters, through phone calls, things that would happen like a pinball machine, in the moment reactive, gets slowed down and played out over a week with some coaching and support from a therapist. We start to develop self and tools for connection in that process. One of the founders of family therapy, there's a handful of groups or people that are credited with creating family therapy in the 1970s mostly. And one of the pillars of the family therapy movement was Dr. Murray Bowen, a psychiatrist in Washington, D.C. And he never met with two people at the same time. Never met with two people. And yet he's credited with creating the theory and practice of family therapy, one of the important pillars of that. Because we carry around inside of ourselves an internal system, right? And that's why when your children get with us, they recreate the same kind of dynamics. That's why you can get divorced and remarried, divorced and remarried time after time. And unless you make progress, you're going to end up in very similar dynamics with your relationships. Because you carry that around with you, and then you set up the system. So the process of going through our childhood means that we come out of it with parts of ourselves, glimpses of ourselves, fractions of ourselves. And then for a lot of us, we seek out intimacy to get what we didn't get in childhood, right? We might be running away. It's never conscious. Even with the most well-intended, fairly reasonably high-functioning person, we seek out to repair things in the past that haven't been healed and haven't been worked out. And I'll talk about that as we go along. When we encounter problems in the other, right? The unspoken message in marital therapy when I work with a couple is, if you could just get this bozo that I'm married to, if you could just get them in shape, we could work this thing out. We'd be okay. They never say that, right? They ask for feedback. They ask for communication skills, tools, facilitation, but there is this idea that the problem is in the other person. From childhood, we internalize this bad mother object, right? This mother that's disappointed or critical. It could be a father or a mother. The phrase in developmental psychology is bad mother. So when our partner is upset with us, frustrated with us, exasperated with us, right? We're playing that out over and over again. We're trying to please them. We're trying to be good enough. We're trying to be lovable enough. We're trying not to be the bad one. We can't tolerate the bad feeling inside. It's absolutely easier to see the wounds in our partner than it is to see our own. Right? That's almost absolutely universal. James Hollis said, more often The pathology of the parent-child relationship is calling the shots. Who in their right mind would seek out someone and say, I want you to repeat my childhood wounding. I will love you because you are so familiar. Right? There's something familiar about that partner. And in the early phases of courtship, of falling in love, it's invisible to us. Alice Miller says, when that doesn't work, we have children to give us the unconditional love and the sense of being okay, right? When our partner stops making us feel good and soothed, then we have children to do that for us. And that's why I spend so much of my time and energy trying to turn that on its head, to tell parents that children aren't there to make you feel good. Children aren't there to contain you. Children aren't there to satisfy your needs, your ego needs, your sense of feeling good. That's your responsibility. I believe it's the same in a marriage, but it's more fundamentally important and critical that it be correct in the parent-child relationship. Otherwise, we pass on those wounds. Excuse me. So we seek healing through relationship. We look to find what we didn't get. I talked about the idea of triangulation, Dr. Murray Bowen. I mentioned him earlier. He identified an emotional triangle as a way for couples, dyads, to reduce anxiety and stabilize relationships during cycles of closeness and distance. It is so easy to talk about somebody else, right? Some people fall in love over that, talking about their ex-spouses and what demonic monsters they were. A lot of people spend early years in therapy talking about that exclusively. You know, I always think that one of the most courageous steps that a client can take in therapy is to talk about the relationship between them and their therapist, sitting right across from them. That's a lot riskier. That's a lot more vulnerable. How is that going to go? Is that going to go like it did with my mother and father when I was upset with them? Is that going to go like it's gone with my friends, with my partners, my romantic partners, when I expressed frustration, anger, upset at them? So it's a great risk. And if you have an adequate therapist, they're going to be able to hold that and contain that. So we focus our energy, our anxiety on the problem child, the child that's struggling. When the child gets better or gets removed and put into treatment, then all we are left with is each other. Sometimes we're left with other children who then become sort of an identified patient. A lot of families, a lot of siblings have told me over the years, over the decades, that when their son, when their brother or sister were taken out of the family or started to get better, that they became the focus of parents' anxiety, frustration. Triangles, Bowen says, are more rigid, more stable during times of stress, and more fluid during times with lower levels of anxiety. It's a safe way and stable way to manage a relationship by not dealing with each other directly. The creation of a triangle can occur by inviting another into the dyad or by an individual sensitive to the anxiety inserting themselves into the dyad, right? The child acts out to take the focus off the couples, their parents' inadequacies in the relationship. If I can become the focus, then mom and dad are going to worry about fight with me, not with each other. Or they're going to rally together, is another way to think of it. When Salvador Minuchin, one of the other founders, considered founders of family therapy, was talking about this dynamic of triangulation, he gave it some different language, but essentially the same thing. He said, when parents aren't able to resolve problems between them, they may direct their focus of concern away from themselves and onto the child, perhaps even reinforcing the maladaptive behavior in the child. And his original studies were with diabetic children, anorexic children. He could measure sugar levels, insulin levels in children based on parental conflict. There was a correlation there. He called it detouring. Detouring occurs when parents, rather than directing anger or criticism towards each other, focus on the negativity on the child And the parent-child conflict thus serves to distract from the tension in the marital subsystem. This type of triangulation also is sometimes referred to as scapegoating, as the child's well-being is sacrificed in order that the marital conflict might be avoided. Again, the way these theorists talk about it would lead one to believe perhaps that it was conscious or overt or dramatic. It's fairly subtle, and it's incredibly common, even if it's to a smaller extent. What Mnuchin used to do when families would come in with teens that were struggling with these various issues is he would have an assignment each time where he would tell the parents to thank the child for bringing the family into therapy. And then he would ask the parents to, on the way home, for example, buy the child an ice cream and sit down and fire them. Fire them from being the identified patient and make a commitment to the child that they were going to work on family therapy regardless of the child's level of symptomology. Right? He wanted to create this ritual where it wasn't going to be an identified patient system, but it was going to be the family was going to be the identified patient. And the child in these examples were just the lightning rod, right? Just the thing that got the family into therapy. And that was something he started to do with every family as a way to kind of shift the focus. This is from a sibling of one of our clients who said to me, since he left, I think I've now become the bad kid, she said. This is from a 14-year-old. I guess without my brother here, they're able to focus more on finding things that make me the worst of the litter now. I also believe I've become more irritable because I now feel like I'm thought of as the bad apple among my other siblings. Not an uncommon sentiment at all. Parents would probably experience that as now that we've got the brother into therapy, we had more energy and time for the other children. And so we were more observant, perhaps. That's how they would experience it. Cross-generational coalitions, which means that when a parent would align with a child, kind of pull them up into the adult system, parentifying the children, turning the child into a pseudo-spouse. Cross-generational coalitions exist when one of the parents responds to the child's needs with excessive concern and devotion, called enmeshment, while the other parent withdraws and becomes less responsive, disengagement. This is one of the most common dynamics that we see. And so again, the way that Mnuchin looked at it is he was trying to shift the entire system. And that was a part of reducing the symptomology and symptoms in the child. So how do we de-triangulate? Well, in therapy, the presence of a therapist may serve to interrupt as the therapist takes on a non-anxious role with a couple, right? They kind of become the facilitator. The referee is not the right word, but a way to kind of moderate between the two, to absorb the anxiety, to help the couple communicate. Part of it is owning your stuff, owning your unhappiness and your anger, knowing that that's your responsibility. It's not your choice. We don't experience our anxiety over our child's drug addiction or self-harm behavior. We don't experience that as a choice, but it's ours to own, to manage, to work on. So like I always say, when we show up to the child, with the child, in the role of a parent, we can be there for them instead of them being there for us. Joining, validating, offering support, challenging, encouraging autonomy and differentiation. There has to be a separateness for most families as a start to intimacy. Most families experience clinging, responsiveness, dependency, reactivity. They experience, that's what they were taught was intimacy and closeness. And it's not. It's fusion. It's enmeshment. It's over-identification. And in enmeshment or over-identification, there's a lack of individuation, a lack of autonomy, a lack of self. By definition, over-identification means a lack of seeing the other person as separate. And the placement of the identified patient can allow for the couple to refocus or focus or recommit or commit to their coupleship. That's the idea of this broadcast, right? This is a place when you can do it. I think it can happen separate from this. I think it can happen in addition to all of this, but this is why I wanted to talk about this. And besides the fact that I think that there are more things in common in our relationships than are different. Differentiation, I talk about that all the time. So definitively, it's the balance of self and connection. Neither is sacrificed for the other, right? I can be me, you can be you. I can hear, respond, contain, love, have compassion for, be curious with you, and vice versa. And I don't have to require core parts, authentic parts, real parts of myself to be accepted in this dyad. There's space for me in this dyad. Intimacy cannot be achieved to the extent that the self is not present. And so if intimacy is requiring one of you to not be you, it's not real intimacy. It's something else. And it's not too much love, right? Enmeshment over identification is not too much love. It's a little bit of love mixed with a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear. Healthy detachment is synonymous with healthy connection. They're one and the same. They're not different. I believe that the reason that in self-help they use, and in 12-step they use the phrase healthy detachment, I'm convinced, is because that's what it feels like. It feels like distance for most of us. I prepare families all the time that if you develop healthy boundaries, it's going to feel like abandonment to both of you. Because again, all you knew, all you've been taught is that connection is reactive, it's dependent, it's fusion. Systems that support differentiation allow for differences and provide a sense of belonging without the exclusion of the other. This idea of selflessness, being selfless is some ideal to strive for. Who among us, Delmore Schwartz says, who among us can ever know ourselves well enough to be capable of agape, an expression of what we might oxymoronically call disinterested love, that is, love wholly invested in the well-being of the other, without the shadow of a self-interest cruising beneath the surface like a shark. Right? It's this idea that we have needs. We still, part of our desires, our wishes are always beneath the surface. And it be reasonable, or at least less than idea, to seek for and imagine something such as selfless love. My experience is that the greatest love comes from a source of abundance. When I have enough that I can give without needing something in return for it. That's not selfless love. That's self-full love. Intimacy. This is a really important point in tonight's broadcast because I think it's one of the most misunderstood points. It's not harmonious, right? It doesn't. We think of intimacy like, right, warm and kind and soft and inviting. That could be something that develops over time, but intimacy for most people, virtually everybody, starts off as horribly frightening and disappointing and lonely. It's two people showing up and telling the truth. And those include things like, I'm angry, I'm sad, I'm resentful, I don't like this. Sometimes I find you unattractive. Sometimes I fantasize about leaving this marriage, or I'm tempted to get divorced. I mean, imagine all the truth that comes out of it. And if the other has the extraordinarily rare capacity to provide a space for that, to contain that, it is amazing. But it's very rare, and in my experience, takes a lot of practice. to get to that point, to become an adequate container. Initially, it feels horrible. Initially, the person telling their true story feels pretty liberated and feels close, and the person on the receiving end feels horrible and wants to withdraw, feels rejected, feels judged, feels unloved, right? Because they're lacking in differentiation. They've lost the capacity to see the other person, and they have to tend to their own wounds and retreat to do so. But if with some support and help and vision, they can stay in it, even if temporarily there's a desire to retreat. There's nothing better. Why would we ever want to leave something that would be so welcoming of us and all of our imperfections and craziness in our feelings? That's the most attractive thing in the world, but that takes a great deal of capacity that develops over time. And early participants in couples therapy won't recognize it. It's overwhelming. A lot of people will say, I hear them saying in early sessions in couples therapy, I want intimacy. I want to hear what she thinks or feels, or I want to hear what he thinks and feels. And my thought is, I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure. My experience is hearing what he or she really thinks and feels is frightening and hurtful and sad and scary and upsetting and discouraging. Until you build up enough self, enough capacity, enough vision to be able to see the other person. And you're not at that point ignoring pain or allowing yourself to be walked over, right? Disrespected. You realize that you're actually doing something we call loving, and it doesn't hurt and it doesn't threaten. And again, that takes a lot of practice. Honoring the other, James Hollis says, and allowing for differences. It is to open the door of to freeing, excuse me, it is to open the door to freeing self and other to be who each other is meant to be. It is to be both open to the possibility of something called love. James Hollis, by the way, this is from a book called The Eden Project, a lot of these quotes tonight. It's a fantastic, deep and dense read if you want to kind of understand the psychology we're talking about tonight of relationships. In intimacy, we own our fear and our anxiety. We don't project it on to the other person as badness. Most A fundamental problem that happens in relationships is a feeling of inadequacy, fear, anxiety in me. Instead of owning it, I turn you into a cold, selfish, narcissistic, insensitive, overbearing, choose the adjective, person, so I don't have to own my stuff. And to the extent that that projection triggers you, we end up in severe conflict. If you have enough self that you can either absorb it, own it yourself, or let it pass through you, the conflict doesn't occur. Learning to feel, to allow for feelings, to be present with them, resisting the urges for that fear tell us that we have to control things and people. The terrifying nature of romance and intimacy, because it is risking everything, right? Rejection, shame, being alone. It's absolutely a terrifying prospect. Another point that I want to talk about tonight that I've not talked about in previous webinars on coupleship is this differentiation that needs to happen between loving and needing. Came to me in some work I was doing a couple of years ago with a couple. They were exploring the idea of needing each other versus loving each other and asking me the question, is it okay to need each other? And I said, of course it is. We need other people in our lives. We need support. That's a part of what we do. The danger becomes when you think that needing is a higher form of love or that it has anything to do with love. When in a very simple way, loving and needing are opposites. It's okay to love and need the same person, but don't confuse the two. Don't conflate the two. I went on to say it's critical that we learn to distinguish between loving and needing. Many think of needing as a deeper, higher form of love. Loving is a giving thing, as in, how can I help you? What do you need to feel supported? What do you need from me? Needing, on the other hand, is a taking thing. Can you do this for me? It's okay to love and need someone, but we must be able to see the difference between the two. If we do not see it and acknowledge it, a few things will occur. Feelings of resentment and abandonment will happen between the two of you. And the projection of our inadequacies will be onto the other. In other words, if my needs go unmet, if what I'm asking from you, you can't give, or I can't acknowledge that I need it, then instead of dealing with my needs, my emptiness, I'm going to make you a bad wife or a bad husband. You work too much. You don't care about me, right? I turn you in, instead of turning you into an inadequate person who has human limitations, I turn you into a bad object. And when I turn you into a bad object, I don't have to cope with my needs, right? Conversely, if your needs are overwhelming for me, instead of dealing with my inadequacy, I turn you into a selfish, needy, histrionic, melodramatic person. Same thing. I can't deal with my inadequacy. I can't own it. I'm afraid of it. So instead of sitting in that, owning it, I turn you into something is wrong with you that you need to talk about it this much. Something is wrong with you. Nobody thinks like that. Nobody needs this much, right? That's the dynamic of projection when the relationship starts to experience conflict and fall apart. Hollis says, so to be fascinated by the other is to be possessed by an affected idea. I love this quote. This is what happens in projection. In the most rabid stage of being in love, and rabid is by no means too strong of a word, one is unable to do other than obsessed on the other. One is caught up in a projective identification with the heart's desires, the boundaries between self and other dissolving again, as they did for the infant. Accepting the journey obliges one to accept fear and to let go of our chief fantasies. So again, this is this idea of falling in love, of romantic love. He's suggesting comes from unresolved, processed childhood dilemmas and wounds. I wrote this to kind of talk about the stages of projection. Think about this as a falling in love couple. First, a person is convinced that, excuse me, this isn't actually mine. This is Hollis's. Mine comes a little bit later. First, a person is convinced that his or her experience is truly outer, right? That what I'm experiencing about you is about you. The second stage is of the projective process arises out of the often gradual perception of discrepancy, the widening gulf between who the other is supposed to be and our concrete experience, right? Our expectations. The third stage of the projective process obliges a perception of this new perception of the other. The fourth stage leads one to recognize that what one perceived was actually not real, that one was not experiencing the other out there, but the other in there. And then the fifth stage requires the search for the origin of that projected energy into oneself. That's a pretty complicated way of understanding it. That's what the challenge with this book. So I'll share with you my own version of that. Before I do that, let me talk about what to do. Some of these are pretty simple. Practice healthy self-care. Don't make others responsible for our happiness. There's a great viral video that I saw of Will Smith that I've shared with some of you where he and his wife, the actor Will Smith, figured out at some point that it was not their job to make each other happy, but it was their job to go and get happy and then come to the marriage happy so they could be there for each other. And that is contrary to most people's fundamental idea of marriage. Learning to understand yourself, your history, your context is important. Listen and allow for differences. Avoid shaming, manipulation, and violence. Violence is the language of the inarticulate, right? When we can't get what we need from the other person, we become more and more aggressive, turning them more and more into the bad object. And then, of course, understanding boundaries. What Joseph Campbell said about marriage. I love this quote. I think that one of the problems, he said, in marriage is that people don't realize what it is. They think it's a long love affair, and it isn't. Marriage has nothing to do with being happy. It has to do with being transformed. And when the transformation is realized, it's a magnificent experience. But you have to submit, you have to yield, you have to give, you can't just dictate. And Hollis goes on to add, transformation is about enlargement, and enlargement generally comes from suffering. So now, my version of the projective process, I tried to kind of take Hollis's idea and make it more practically accessible to us. So imagine person one. You can put person one as the male, the female. Maybe this is two males or two females or another variation. But think of person one. In person one, there's a hole, a wound, unfinished business anxiety. So that's everybody, right? Person one finds somebody who fills that hole. It makes person one feel good, soothed, complete. That feeling is reflected back onto the other person. You are good for making me feel better. Or, in other words, I love you. Person two internalizes that feeling, that expression as, you too healed my wound. You have given me the feeling that I have been seeking, the feeling that I am enough. Or, I love you too. Person two is unable or unwilling to continue eventually, right? Just because of the human limitation, to continue being responsible, capable of responding to person one's well-being. They fall short. Person one accuses person two of being a bad partner. They fall out of love. To get out of this process, each must take responsibility for their own happiness. They must come to the marriage happy so when they show up, they can support the other from a position of abundance rather than need. In other words, I can't give you anything. There's no gift that exists unless I can give it freely with nothing expected in return, and vice versa. So there's this dependence, this idea that we can fix each other, this idea that I can make you happy, although temporarily it does work, rarely, almost never can be sustained, and doesn't lead to the kind of transformation that Campbell and Hollis are talking about in an evolved marriage. And then, of course, my favorite quote on the subject. I could read this every broadcast and be happy about it. I would encourage you to print this, to put it on your refrigerator, on the corner of your mirror in your bathroom, by Gandhi. A coward is incapable of exhibiting love. It is the prerogative of the brave. Think about this with your partner. Think about this with your child. Projection, fusion, going home is easy. Loving another's otherness is heroic. If we really love other as other, we have heroically taken on the responsibility of our own differentiation and our own journey, and this heroism may properly be called love. In the Milan School of Family Therapy, again in the 1970s, they assigned every family that brought in a child that was struggling the same assignment. They assigned the couple to make sure that the child care was taken care of, to give something to the children, something to the child's caregiver that if there was an emergency, they could be contacted, but then to go on a secret date. That date could be just across the street or across the country or across town. And to keep the details of that a secret. To reestablish what it meant to be a couple. And to take the child out of the equation. Right? A lot of couples talk about when they experience an empty nest, even in situations where there's not a great deal of mental health or addiction issues, about what will we be now without our children between us. Be responsible for yourself and taking care of you. I know it sounds like distance. I know it sounds like, why marriage? I didn't get in this to be alone. But this is the opposite. This is the ability. This is the beginning of being a partner. And when your partner can't take care of you, think about the possibility that instead of being a bad or a selfish person, they're just an inadequate person with limitations. And find another source to support you when they can't. Therapist, sponsor, trusted friend, group. The benefit for you, your coupleship, and your child. This is the building block of human relationship. This is what they talk about at Al-Anon, at Codependence Anonymous, at Families Anonymous, at Adult Children of Alcoholics, right? This is what it means to be a human in relationships. Stop expecting someone else to do what you want. Stop demanding. Stop dictating. And just in doing that, watch how the dynamic changes when there's not the threat of them being bad or a failure or selfish or narcissistic or melodramatic. Avoid intimidating and guilting to get your way, right? Walk away and take care of yourself. Do your work and be responsible for your marriage. If you want to read more about this, you can read the book the Eden Project by James Hollis. Also, you can listen to the webinar on self and other, because it's very similar themes, more in the context of parenting, but very similar themes. Happy to take any questions. I'll let you think about the questions, and before we get to those, I'm going to talk about announcements. We ask all current parents to attend 12, excuse me, I'll try to, had some problems with pronunciation this evening, 6 12-step support groups. Any combination of Al-Anon, CODA, Families Anonymous, even Refuge Recovery if you want a different approach, a Buddhist-inspired, non-higher powered center approach. You can also go to NAMI.org for classes and resources in your area that are affordable or free. All of these broadcasts are available on the podcast app on your iPhone and on your Android device through the SoundCloud app. Just search Evoke Therapy Program. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Evoke Therapy. On Facebook, you can find us by searching Evoke Therapy Programs. You can also find the Alumni Foundation, which helps families who can't afford therapy, by going to Facebook and searching Evoke Family Foundation. Our blog has weekly updated content. My book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, is available on Amazon. Also, audio versions are found there. We ask all current parents, if possible, to attend a workshop while their child is with us. The next one is February 16th and 17th in our Oregon program. You can talk to your therapist if that timing is good for timing for a visit to your child at the same time. Contact Melanie at Evoke Therapy Programs, evoketherapy.com for more information, or to RSVP. If you want to do a deep dive into your own work, Finding You, the upcoming Finding Yous are listed on the slides here: February 20th, March 27th, April 10th, May 15th, and June 26th. If you want to do a couple intensive, those are possible too. Also, family intensives, private intensives, you can find out about those by going to our website, calling our number, or emailing us at intensives@evoketherapy.com. Next parent support groups, February 11th in New York City, Los Angeles, California. February 24th, I'm going to list some more soon. Email Melanie at evoketherapy.com for more information. Pursuits trips are for families: high adventure, think therapy light, adventure therapy, sober fun, a great way to reconnect, recalibrate clinically. Happy to take any live questions. All right, first question. Any advice for separated couples? This might sound a little bit like a punt, but just go do your own work. If I were giving advice, both of you go to Al-Anon separately. I want to be clear. I'm not anti-divorce. There are times when divorce is necessary for the safety and well-being of individuals in a marriage. And it can be the outcome of some of this growth, right? You're allowed to do it, and you don't have to justify it to me or anybody in the world. Having said that, I have found that it's also important that we understand what's going on inside of us. What was our contribution to the dynamic, to the falling in love story? Why did I fall in love with this person? And so go to Al-Anon, go to your individual therapy. My wife and I have been going to, she's been going to our therapist for 21 years. I've been going to for 20. And she's also our couples therapist. She's a rare therapist who does both. We haven't been to couples therapy in years and years, but my therapy is about my relationships with her, with everybody. And I come back with insight, tools, and ideas that make me a better husband. And the same is true of her. I'm not against couples therapy. It's just go do your own work. Go to a finding you. My wife and I, when we were going through a very difficult time in the late 2000s, we both went to our own intensive, which is what inspired me to build the Finding You program. She went first. A couple months later, I went, and it became eventually a building block for us finding each other again. But I had to start off with finding ourselves. Next question. Thank you for this webinar. It's interesting how the things we learn for our children apply to our partners. My marriage has gone through the work has grown through the work that I've done because of my child's struggles. In the past, I reacted to critiques from him as a threat. Now I can hear his suggestions as ideas that I can accept or not accept based on my own truth. With work, I'm able to let him have his feelings and not see them as always about me. And I can show him who I am and feel understood. I am so grateful for this gift that our child has given to us. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's a very simple but eloquent example of how growing changes us, right? The problem isn't out there. It's not. It's the biggest illusion that it's out there in our child, in our spouse, in our friend. Yes, all of those people have problems, but the real dilemma, and the only one that we have any control over whatsoever, and still that's a pretty big mountain to climb, is inside of us. And once we get past the shame or the fear of owning that dilemma, that dynamic, we can start to work on it. And if we have an adequate therapist, or if the motivation of saving our children's life propels us to push past the shame and the fear of guilt, we can get to that point, and then it stops being the same old fight, the same old story, the same old pain. We don't repress our pain. We don't hurt anymore or as much. All right, looks like there's one last comment, it looks like. Oh, I missed it. It says, yes, I was going to ask the same question about advice for divorced couples. How do I manage setting the best expectation for my child who's currently in the program with my ex when my ex undermines everything that I put forth? Yet my son seems to side with her. In the short term, that's going to be a disadvantage. There's no doubt about that. I did a broadcast on co-parenting. I'll probably do it again sometime soon. It's a little bit different than this. Work on your side of the street. That's the answer. Stay on your side of the street. Work on you. Get your ego needs met from somewhere else because you're not going to get it from your ex. And if they're undermining the process, you're not going to get it from your child. My experience in the long run is the child recognizes when a parent is safe, when a parent is doing it for them. It takes a long time, but just it makes a difference. Just show up, do your own work, go to Al. Imagine that your ex, if your ex is undermining, for those of you who have crazy exes, imagine them being an alcoholic and go to Al-Anon in that context. I have somebody in my life that I can't escape because we share this child who's an alcoholic, even if they don't drink. Think of them as having the same kind of crazy thinking as an alcoholic. So I need to go to this place to learn how to deal with that in my life. And it makes a difference. And after a while, you'll change. You'll feel different. You'll feel liberated. You'll feel optimistic. You'll feel hopeful. And I'll say this, in many cases, you showing up differently does contribute to the system, even your ex changing. Now, I don't want to hang that out there too explicitly because I don't want you to go to Al-Anon so that you learn tools to change them, but it can happen. But even if it doesn't, you'll still be okay. So thanks, folks. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for your comments and questions. I appreciate it. As a matter of fact, the next broadcast will be Monday, January 21st at 7 p.m. Mountain Time, where we will be talking about Al-Anon, Coda, and other anonymous meetings. And what happens there, what are the benefits, what are the steps, the traditions, how they apply to you, even if your child is not an alcoholic or a drug addict, because that's one of the biggest misconceptions about the value that these programs add to our lives. So thank you for joining us. Thank you, Fawn, on behalf of your child, for joining these, for looking at yourself, for opening yourself up to this, and have a great week, and I'll talk to you Monday. Bye-bye.